Welcome to Slop Happens. This is Bianca speaking, and today Claudio and I and myself have a guest on our second episode discussing what happens when things go wrong. I'm very happy that we have Maranke Wierenga as a guest today because Maranke is not just a disability advocate, she's actually one of the brains within AI in the Netherlands and in Europe who really is working on equitable AI, assuring that people with disabilities, but also other minorities, have equitable access to AI systems, don't face unfair treatment in decision making or any way different. I think her work is incredible.
It was great. We had a conversation with her. We got into like two different areas, two different aspects in which using AI or using automated technology really can unfairly disadvantage a particular group, even if that's not the intention or even if that's not something that's designed into the system. So we looked at two different applications. One was a parking application in the Netherlands, and we also looked at an application that's used in the U.S. Justice system called COMPAS. And COMPAS, hits a little bit closer to home for me because it was used in a county in Florida where I used to live. And its mission was it's a risk scoring app to provide like a 2-digit numerical score for what are the chances that someone in the justice system is going to commit a crime again. And it's kind of a little bit like the Minority Report. So this county where I used to live in South Florida, basically contracted the makers of COMPAS, and it was being used to help judges decide on what an appropriate sentence would be for someone in the system. And it took an outside organization, ProPublica, looking at public data to actually uncover that the application was actually extremely lopsided, where one group had understated the risk that they were of committing more crimes, and the other group, it vastly overstated the risk of their committing new crimes.
And that is one of the things where researchers like Maranke play a crucial role because without their work on what is equitable and what guardrails should be there, we can never uphold that an AI system or any technical system does not exclude anybody. So, we're very happy to welcome you for this episode and hope you enjoy our stories with Maranke.
Let's dive in. Welcome to Slop Happens, and today we're happy to have an expert on AI, algorithms, and society with us. We have Maranke Wierenga here, and she's an expert in the Netherlands on AI governance, and the sort of issues that come up, particularly if you're using automation and social policy or automation on people. I'm Claudio, Luís, Vera. I have Bianca, Prins with me, and welcome to Slop Happens, Maranke.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Happy to be here.
It's nice to have you, Maranke. We know that you've been working on your PhD, and I know that that's because how we met. Can you give a little bit of background on the thesis you were working on for social technical views on algorithm systems, and especially also a little bit if you want to share what happened with your PhD, because I think it's really important for people to know.
Yeah, so I was working on a PhD at Utrecht University in the Netherlands on algorithmic accountability in Dutch municipalities. So I focused specifically on the public sector and how to use algorithmic systems in, a responsible way and to actually give account for how you use them as an organization. And that ties in with a lot of ethical concerns. The AI Act was also coming into force and was being drafted while I was working on this PhD. So you have this whole regulation, judicial kind of view in there, the ethical part, public administration coming in there, but also technical fields. So it was a very multidisciplinary, well, tongue twister, fields to work in. It was a lot of fun. But unfortunately, I am myself a wheelchair user, and the university was not accessible, so I did not finish, but I did work on it for 7 years. And I am still working in the field, but now as a practitioner.
And you're working... Oh, sorry, Claudio.
I was going to ask, I mean, does that literally translates that you were not able to finish your PhD because you were not able to physically go to the places you needed to go to be able to complete their requirements?
Correct.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that was clear.
She's not the only one, Claudio. This happens quite a lot. That was the reason why I asked. And it's unfortunate because the work done by Maranke is really important. And I think especially the focus on, if I say it wrong, please correct me, Maranke, but your work is really on the public domain and
yes,
a lot of it. And it's really important that people really understand what's going on. And we use lived experts more to explain the barriers people face. And especially if your PhD is focused on how we can make the whole system where new building more accessible, inclusive, and intuitive for everyone, that you're actually getting stuck because of a wheelchair. And that should not be right.
You're absolutely right.
That's just so wrong. That's so wrong. So I'd love to have you explain for a second. You mentioned the social technical view of algorithmic systems. Without any buzzwords, can we have an explanation for anybody who's just in corporate and who's just not familiar with that term?
Yeah, absolutely. So I personally don't like big words as well. So I definitely frame this as a big word, socio-technical systems. But what we basically mean is you have technical components. So the code, for instance, if you will, that actually tells the computer what to do. But that code and that program is being used in practice by people. So that's the social part therein. And this entire combination of those two is also shaped by culture, by norms, by values, and even politics, I would say, that shape how such a system is built, designed, thought of, and built, period.
So, and I imagine this particularly comes into play if you're using technology or you're using an algorithm to score people or to score risk. So what may be risky to some person may not be so much to another. Like, for instance, if I feel that, being a very faith-based or being very religious would lower my likelihood to be criminal or to need social services or that sort of thing, that sort of stuff would be built into the algorithm. It would be weighted in, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
We can talk about a bunch of different examples, but what sort of examples have you run into in your work where these sort of biases come in?
So I think one of the famous examples here is the COMPAS case, which is already a little bit older. But it was an algorithm that was used by law enforcement in the judicial system to set bail. This algorithm was black box, so it was proprietary, and it was very biased against people of color. And it would predict recidivism for black and white defendants at equul rates.
So recidivism being the likelihood of committing another crime.
Yes.
Okay.
So the provider argued that it would predict recidivism at equal rates for both black and white defendants. But from research from ProPublica, it turned out that black defendants who were not arrested again within a 2-year time frame were scored as high risk at twice the rate of white defendants in similar circumstances. So it was highly biased in that regard. And it also scored white defendants who had committed new crime lower than black defendants in the same circumstances. So again, we see bias heavily featured in this system.
So let me see if I can untangle this a little bit. You've got on one hand, you've got a bias which is overstating the rate of a black person in the system to commit new crimes. But at the same time, you've got another separate sort of error where you're understating or you're underestimating the amount of risk that white defendants or white people in the criminal system were presenting.
Correct.
And so I did a little bit of digging because, there's COMPAS, and it's spelled COMPAS. And this was a system that was used, and the study was done in Broward County, Florida, where they looked at, okay, here's what they predicted. And then you went back 2 years later to see, okay, how accurate are the predictions? And spoiler, this is something that you should be doing with any AI or predictive system, is checking your accuracy.
Preferably before you start using it, though, but yeah.
Right. And so what sort of accuracy levels did you have for this?
Oh, I don't know the accuracy levels by heart, because I personally was not involved in the study, but it was dramatic. It was absolutely dramatic, that I do recall. It would be like one of the examples they gave in their study was, so ProPublica highlighted a couple of individual cases, and one case would be a black teenager who stole a kiddie bike, or borrowed it but stole it, right? And then there was a white guy who committed high crime, like robbed people, burglary, etc. And the white guy would get a much the score than the black teenager who rode a kiddie bike and actually returned the bike. So it was like the black teenager got like a 9
right.
in risk profiling, and the white guy, I don't know, like the 3 or a 4 or something like that. And the white guy would actually commit new crimes, whereas the black teenager wouldn't. So there's like this kind of huge discrepancy if you zoom into the individual cases.
Right. So the little bit of digging I did was, you've got, so the corporate arguments for having something like this, or the arguments of bringing in a system like this, is you've got a pretty crowded jail system, and you're faced with this choice: do I need to raise more money to warehouse more people in jails, or are we going to be smarter and more targeted about the people that we do keep in our jail system? So, in Broward, they ended up using it for pretrial. So people who are awaiting trial, and there's like this prison in downtown Fort Lauderdale, right near Las Olas, where all the clubs and stuff are. And there's this high-rise prison. And so they had just built this prison, spent a fortune on it, and it was already full. And so the whole thinking is, let's be smarter. Let's subscribe to the SaaS service, basically, software as a service, and that's going to give us some sort of a number or score that's going to predict. And so what we should do is we should only keep the people in jail that we feel are above a certain score, and, put everybody else out on bail. So we're going to be more intelligent about who we use the jails for. And so there's, from a municipal point of view, it totally makes sense that you would look for something like this. But with an error rate of like 65%, it's like, what do you do?
Yeah, it's barely better than a coin toss. It's really shocking that such systems with such low success rates get used in such high stake environments.
So the sad thing is that Broward County didn't go and test the data themselves or test the accuracy within their system. It took ProPublica to come in and do it and test their system. And it's a fairly professional justice system. It may not be one of the finest in the country, but you're not talking about a totally decrepit, corrupt system in Broward County. So they're making logic or evidence-based decisions for the most part, and certainly back in 2016 before things got really out of hand.
I am curious is, at first, where did they get these data? Because if this average is so off, and if these estimations are so off, it seems interesting to first search where data came from and how data was assessed. And I think if you want to put in any fair system, you really need to make sure that the data you're using is the correct data. And if you look at this case and looking at it back, and if I listen well to your story, it also shows that there was no real evidence that the data originally used to build this algorithm was already correct. So there was already a flaw in the data. And I think in a case like this, it's really important, and maybe I skip a few steps, but it's really important to make sure that the data used is the correct data. So would it have helped? And that's also in relation to fairness of such a system. Would it have helped if there would be better guardrails on what data must how data must be reviewed before it's been used in an algorithm?
I think that would definitely help. So the data that underlies the working of COMPAS is questionnaires, which are self-assessments that defendants need to fill out. And Claudio, you actually went through them, and nothing in there indicates like race or ethnicity. But at the same time, looking at how these results are so incredibly biased, there are proxies in there. Even though race is not explicitly mentioned, you still have characteristics or features in there that heavily correlate to race. So you can still deduce race, even though race is never mentioned in the questionnaire itself. And I think that is one key characteristic of, cleaning your data and actually making sure that you are not working with garbage data, is that you filter out these kind of proxies.
Right. There's 137 questions in there, and they have all these different categories. And at face value, they look like they make sense. You're looking at family history, or your parents drug addicts. You're looking at your own drug use. You ask questions about criminal personality. Like, do you feel like it's okay to be violent to people? Or some people are just so terrible that they should just be treated like animals. I mean, questions that for somebody who is not a criminal, like answering, these sort of questions would have fairly obvious answers. And if you're buying a system like this, and say you're with Broward County and you're purchasing a system like this, you'd say, well, this is colorblind. And then the results are mathematical. So what we're doing is we're getting rid of the bias that judges have. But then when you test what the predictions are, even though there's not a single question about race or gender in this questionnaire, you find that the results and the predictions are absolutely biased. And it could be because a lot of the markers for criminality here also correlate with social class, which then also in the United States tends to correlate with skin color. So you've got like an underclass, and you're kind of perpetuating a lot of the sort of biases, and you're perpetuating a lot of the sort of unfairness that exists. So I would think like one of the real important takeaways to somebody who's looking into systems like this is, even if the questions have nothing to do with what you think is biased, even if it's not in the training data, you need to test against this, and you need to have a separate data set.
Yeah, exactly. Because the thing is, we tend to treat data as if it's objective or neutral, but data is grown from a society which already has inequalities built into it. So there are marginalized tendencies which tend to repeat itself within data. So because the way, well, we're talking about COMPAS in the American context, so the way that the American justice system and police, well, there are racial inequalities in how that they treat particular communities. That is kind of perpetuated into data, in the sense that if police start patrolling certain neighborhoods in a larger extent, you get more of those people in your data set. So
Right.
they will be recommended, or they will be listed as high risk in more often, even though you haven't searched in other neighborhoods. So there's a kind of, well, overemphasis, perhaps.
It's
which
what
is
you search for, you
historical
find
and
it.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So you can't prove bias unless you have that sort of testing data that you can test with. And the folks at ProPublica, what they did is they took all of the different results from COMPAS, or they took all the different cases that were being reviewed by COMPAS, and then they matched them to the case intake information, which is public record. So if you're going into the Broward County criminal system, then essentially they're capturing your date of birth, you're declaring your race on some sort of a form, and your name. So what ProPublica did is they matched the race from that with the data set from the COMPAS system, and then used that to test. And so unless you did something like that where you're combining two data sets, or you've got this data that you can train against, then you can't really do that sort of testing for bias. So for all we know, the system could be extremely biased against, let's say, people who own pit bulls. But because that data is not being captured, you can't determine any sort of correlation, or you can't even see if people who are pit bull owners are being unfairly discriminated against.
Yeah, it's a very interesting conundrum where you need to have certain protective data to actually test whether or not a system is biased or discriminating. But you need sensitive data to test that against. So there is a sort of, that often doesn't make sense for a lot of people. I've had a lot of conversations with people in the Dutch context, like aldermen, for instance, who know, like, yeah, but that doesn't make sense because we don't want to have that kind of data. We want to be privacy friendly. We want to not even have those kind of information about people. But yeah, if you want to make sure that your system doesn't discriminate, you're going to have to mitigate risk somehow. And this is one of the ways in which you could do it.
Yeah,
Right.
I proposed it once as using a Chinese wall, which you often see within organizations, and make sure that you do have records of specific data to make sure, and that was done in the context of disability, because you have to know what assistive technology people use to make sure that their service is equal, or they can use a system on an equal base. But you don't want the system to make a decision based on the fact that you know that the person has a disability. So, and there should be a Chinese wall in between, meaning that the system cannot make a decision based on the knowledge that a disability is registered. And if it's disability or race, I mean, it's for the same, it's the same sensitive type of information. And that is something that people really find hard to understand, that you actually need information which is sensitive to make sure that a decision is made fairly, or that a system functions well. And I think that is one thing which also has to land with a lot of people advocating for more equality in algorithms and in systems, because I noticed it the same thing in the conversations. And if I'm incorrect, please correct me again, Maranke, but the Dutch toeslagenaffaire has a lot of relations to what I found in the COMPAS case, as far as I mean, I'm looking at it from a compliance perspective and not from a technological perspective. It has a lot of overlap. And the interesting part is that a lot of people say, yeah, but they made decisions, and if some information which are related to ethnicity backgrounds and stuff, then you won't have such cases anymore. But I think actually that is not the reason, because if we trace it back, and that's the same thing you see in the COMPAS case, is that where people live, where they're coming from, what areas they live, what how family relations are, all these types of information, they connect to a certain standard of living or certain class of living. And if you put that together, then it often relates to specific groups in society. And if you want to make sure it's not biased, you actually need to know to which groups people belong. And that imbalance is something which is, it's not just for the lawmakers to understand, but also for the people advocating for equality to understand that it is important sometimes to register things, not for the sake of registration, but for the sake of making sure there's no bias in the data or in the system or in the algorithm.
Yeah, absolutely. So you need like a testing set with certain characteristics, and then you need a data set which you actually use to train a model, for instance, which does not have those characteristics, but you want to be able to test against them with your testing set.
So you actually need 3 sets of data, because you need your training data to build your app. Then your developers need to save 1/3 of that data. So you gather data, and you can use up to 2/3 of your data to train your algorithm. Then you need 1/3 to test it as you're building the application, as you're trying to improve the accuracy rate of whatever app or predictive model you're building. Then you need the external data, which could be things related to social factors or whatever you want to test with down the road, which is like shouldn't even be exposed to the team that's building the application. Yep.
And that's why I said you need the Chinese, at least I see it, that you need Chinese walls to make sure. And I see the same thing if I look at the current discussions around AI in Europe. And I see the same things popping up. And I'm like, why don't anybody discuss this? That sometimes you do need data as a backup system to make sure that things are correct. And
that is actually something that the AI Act has fixed, in the sense of, because well, I suppose it's similar in the US context, but in the Netherlands and in Europe, we need to have a particular base and grounds to actually use personal data. So we're not allowed under the GDPR to just randomly use personal data. We need to have a legal grounds to actually be able to use that data. And the GDPR did not foresee the use of personal data to actually test these kind of systems, but the AI Act gave us a new legal ground to actually use personal data for this purpose. So that is better.
So technically it is there, but on the other side, I do notice that privacy officers in organizations say, no, you're not allowed because that is GDPR restricted data. So I think the AI Act fixed it. But if I look at it in practice, you still have legislation which restricts it. So the effect is not there. And that's maybe better said than, and as I said it before, but I think the whole idea of using this type of data to verify if a system is working, you still need everything to work together. And that's, I think, the one that's still
the challenge. Yeah.
It starts raising these real huge and important questions of like, who should have the data? How should they steward it? And who do we trust to do that? So having it, perhaps testing for fairness inside the same, well, certainly not within the same development team, to be testing for fairness. Maybe within the same corporation, you should be able to do some sort of preliminary testing before you roll something out the door. So it's like pre-launch, but then post-launch, with the Broward County case and with COMPAS, we're fortunate enough that Broward exposed a lot of its data to the public. So that allows for citizen journalism, or that allows, for professional journalists or professional data scientists like the folks at ProPublica to look at this. But at what point do you have to start worrying about, okay, you have it within the government. Is the government going to potentially misuse this for repression? Is the government going to be misusing this to pursue an agenda that has nothing to do with the original application? Is privacy more important than being able to test for equity and fairness in AI systems? And these are systems these are probably questions that we have to kind of resolve case by case. But in legislation or in governance, is that something that's being addressed? Like, who does actually police these systems, and who should have access to the data that you would need to have oversight on AI models?
So there's a lot of work being done in standardization. So perhaps you've heard of ISO standards. Those are international agreements that sectors make amongst themselves to govern particular things. So if you have a phone, we now use USB-C outlets for everything, right? So that is a standard that is governed by a standard. Similarly, there are standards for data governance, for AI being drafted, and typically, I'm also part of standardization practices, and typically we try to capture these kind of questions in standards. So who is best equipped within an organization to do this? Or what kind of responsibilities do we need to assign somewhere in this organization, in what particular constellation? So there's a lot of good work being done, but it's not finished because it's such a hasty topic, right? AI. So it's coming so fast, and it's very difficult to actually keep up with it. And standardization is unfortunately a very slow practice. So it's going to take a while, but we'll get there at some point.
I mean, one of the things I worry about with AI is that it's evolving so quickly that by the time we come out to coming up with rules that apply to models of a particular type, then something else has been created, or it's been applied in some other way that we never could imagine. Or it could be just something as appalling and heinous as, like, Grok and the whole Nudify scandal that's been happening. So you can't predict that. But are there universal principles, or are there things that can transcend this year's technology, where you develop a standard or you develop a set of principles that are still make sense 10 years from now?
I think in a basis, you can ask similar questions to whichever digital technology you want to use. So in my PhD research, I focused on algorithms, which is a technological agnostic view on these systems, which is a big word for saying I don't really care if it's like the newest AI model or if it's a simple decision tree, because I can ask similar questions to these systems. So who is making it? Why are they making it? With what purpose are they making it? Who is involved in this process of making it, and what voices are not heard? What is being prioritized and what isn't? What values are at stake here, and what do we want to protect? What do we want to avoid? These kind of questions you can ask to any system. It doesn't really matter what kind of technology you put into it, because it's around the technology, right? It's about the socio-technical stuff, where the socio is doing a lot of work, if you will.
Right. I know you've done other work, towards your PhD, and you've looked at other different sort of applications. You've even looked at automated parking control and stuff. So where maybe instead of looking just at a binary predicting or scoring system, maybe we look a little bit more holistically as how maybe an AI technology like computer vision or being able to recognize license plates is actually implemented. And here you start getting into issues of equity, like within the user experience or in terms of how designers or how the system itself is designed. And so tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing along those lines.
Yeah, so I am always interested in where lived experience and professional expertise intersect. Being a wheelchair user, I have a disability parking permit. So it's a European permit that grants me and other people who use this card certain rights to park in disability parking spaces throughout Europe. And such a card is given to a person, not a car. And this becomes later on. So keep that in mind. So the rules and privileges differ from country to country and from city to city, which makes it not great. But, what do you do? And in the Netherlands, often parking rights are extended to street parking as well. So not just the designated disability parking spaces, but you can also park in whatever space in, the open street, basically.
Okay.
And this increasingly became a problem when municipalities started to automate parking control. Because today they often use scan cars, they call them. So cars equipped with a lot of cameras on the roof that use computer vision to scan license plates and then check those license plates against a database to check whether or not you have paid your parking fees or whether or not you have a permit or an exemption to paying those fees.
So the scan cars would be like what you would see back in the days when they had Google Maps roaming through neighborhoods and photographing everything, or even Waymo. So you've got little small cars with lots of cameras.
Yeah, basically, yeah. Yeah, so they scroll around, so they drive around and they check every car. And the way that each city does it differs a little bit. But in general, so it works like it scans the license plate, checks against the database, and then it decides whether or not you have paid your dues or whether you are exempt from them. And remember when I told you that the parking permit is person bound, not car bound?
Right.
Because this is where this becomes a problem. Because so in ye olde times, an officer would actually just walk by the windshield of your car, check whether or not this card is placed under the windshield, and then would go about his day. But nowadays, it scans your license plate, but my permit card is not tied to my car. It's tied to me. So you need to actually now apply for additional permits to basically couple your physical card,
right,
which is person bound, to a license plate. So it's a digital permit that transfers those rights to whatever car you are driving in at the moment.
So let's just pause there for a second. So you're changing the technology for parking enforcement. You're changing what you're using to look at these cards, but you're putting the burden on the people who are parking to adapt to that technology and to go. So it becomes a disability tax, basically.
Yes, it does. Because this is not, in the Netherlands, this is not arranged nationally. So you have to apply for each permit for each city that uses these cars. So it's just an administrative hell, basically.
Wow.
And the fun part is actually Maranke and another group of people are working on this and actually have a sort of a training. And you have to figure out how it works in a city. And it's really hard to figure out because even if you are, let's assume that you are able to research this and to do a basic search, then you still cannot find the information. And even if you're the tech savvy person, you can still not find the information because every city has it labeled differently. And I'm not using these permits, so I have no idea how they work. And to be honest, I've been working in accessibility and disability inclusion for years.
Right.
And then how did nobody think about this? This is so incredibly bad. I was surprised how crappy this system is, because actually putting the burden of proof with the person with a disability, technically, you have to, if you get a fine, you have to prove that you were there and your card was behind the windshield. So every time you park somewhere, you have to make a picture of your car and show, hey, the card was there, I was in the
Oh,
right spot. And I was so surprised that even such simple thing, I mean, you would imagine it to be simple, would be so complex. And it's just unfair because it hits one group.
Yeah, and the way of procuring these additional permits in cities is also very invasive. So one of the municipalities where I tried to get this extra permit initially asked me for my payslip, a monthly payslip, as one of the documents. Well, I fought it, and eventually I won, but yeah, it's just ridiculous the amount of information that they
how would your
want.
pay stub? How is your pay stub relevant to where you park? I'm trying to understand that one.
It isn't. That's why I won, but they thought it was.
Now, given my experience with, with cities down here in public transportation, it would be like my daughter, if she had to get a bus pass to be able to ride on public transportation as a student, she'd have to go to a specific grimy office, in downtown Miami and be able to find, that's like hidden and only works through like very limited hours and, is not the most efficient thing in the world. I mean, was that part of your experience? Like you're a wheelchair user and you have to go to a physical office someplace or for each town?
For one of the cities, I had to go physically. Yes. Yeah. And in some cities, it's pretty easy to get the permit. In others, it really isn't. Or not only do they ask for a lot of information, but it takes them weeks to process the permit. So if you want to go to, I don't know, Amsterdam spontaneously, yeah, that's not happening because you need 2 weeks to file for the permit. And it takes them forever to actually get it processed.
So let's say we could rewind time. We could go back, like say 3 or 4 years or however, to when they first were designing or coming up with these systems. What would it have taken to do this right without creating this extra burden? If you're designing an app, what do you need to have in mind?
I think a lot of the times, I think the problem here is that they actually, a lot of these municipalities actually did like fundamental rights impact assessments. They dutifully checked all of the boxes. They had all of the conversations, but what they didn't do is check how this process of parking enforcement is tied in with other processes. So everything is like, it's in silos, right? And no one is checking what the water bed effects downstream are when you change something in silo A. And I think that is a real problem. And that is reinforced by, well, not having the people that it concerns in the room.
Right.
So if they had a person with disabilities in the room, they would have told them, like, this is not a good idea, and here's why, and let's think about ways that we can prevent this.
So essentially, you're designing an app that impacts parking for folks with disabilities, but there's nobody with a disability in the room to say, "Oh, well, this is actually what your policy would mean for us."
Yeah, so it's not an app, but it's parking control via computer vision. But yeah, basically, yeah, they're not involved.
But in essence, if you would look at this case, and you would use, for example, we have the app ParkBee in the Netherlands to do the paid parking. Technically, if you would be able to register in ParkBee and say, hey, I have a checkbox, I have a disability card for parking. And in that case, that if that system would connect and check and then would say, okay, wait, this person has the disability card for parking, it's allowed here. and maybe the system should make an extra picture of the car and it can be manually checked, that would be an easy solution. Or, hey, there is a check here, you send in a person, because it's also very practical just to send in a person to check, because the card is not always clearly visible, because it moves or whatever happens. So if you would think about these, it would be the communication of one system to the other system, and the ability to put in a check and say, then it's still extra work. I mean, you have to put in the check that you have the card. On the other
Right.
side, it would prevent a lot of issues later on if you would just have the ability to mark the checkbox.
So
Yeah, so they actually created an app for this, they tried. They're still working on it, and it doesn't work fantastically, because you can only use it in a certain municipalities. So it's like, I don't know, 5 municipalities in the Netherlands. We have 300 plus municipalities. So this is
right.
basically not helpful. And you can only use the app if your own municipality partakes. So that, again, not very useful.
And is that general use, or is that just for people with disabilities?
Just for people with disabilities, just for their parking permit.
With if you would fix it in the general parking app, then it would not be a separate solution, because now it's separate. I mean, for people in the US, it would be really surprising that you have a separate parking app if you have a disability, because it would be in the regular app.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I agree.
I mean, to me, it sounds like we're running into limitations with the choice of technology. So what you're using to determine whether somebody is parking legally or not here is you're using this automatic number plate recognition technology. So you've got a camera that's looking at a plate that is positioned at a certain place, a certain height on a vehicle, and you're using that to determine, can somebody park right? Which is great if you're just dealing with vehicles. But if you're dealing with people who may go to different vehicles, then it doesn't work. But it just seems like, okay, well then why isn't there a camera that looks for a card that is on the driver's side window, with something that's very visible and easily scannable? It really seems like just the choice of the computer vision technology is what has all these ripple effects.
Yeah, and the way in which human intervention is or isn't used within the system, basically, because there's also municipalities that say you don't need to apply for an extra permit, even though we use scan cards, because if we get a hit, we just send one person on a scooter, past all of the cars, and they check for extra permits, and you don't need to deal with the extra burden of administration. So that's also an option.
So if we're to look at bias in the system here, I mean, the bias is towards false positives. So it's like, oh, well, we're going to err on the side of nailing more people, issuing more fines, because that brings the municipalities more money, because God forbid we should err on the side of being more forgiving, because that means less revenues for us. So the system itself is biased towards false positives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, it's a political choice what you want to optimize for. And it's funny you mentioned that in light of fairness, because what's really interesting about this field, and honestly, I'm not an expert on AI fairness. This is a whole different ballgame. But there are 20 plus definitions of fairness that you can optimize for in a system, and they exclude one another. So you can optimize, for instance, for equal outcomes on an individual basis, or group fairness, but those can bite each other. So you need to pick what you think is fair in a given circumstance, and that might differ.
So if I were, let's say I'm working on a team inside of a tech company, and I'm designing or developing the software, what would be the best thing I could do? Is it go find an expert? Is there stuff out there that can kind of help guide me towards setting what our internal standard of fairness is?
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of work being done on fairness. In the Netherlands, we are working on a technical agreement for risk profiling algorithms like the ones we just discussed with COMPAS, where they're providing best practices on how to measure fairness therein. I worked with the municipality of Amsterdam to create the Fairness Handbook, which is a guideline on how to test for fairness throughout the entire life cycle of such a system. And there's loads of other work being done by various members in the academic and technical community. Yeah, so there are a lot of guidelines therein, but I think the most important thing is find someone who's an expert who can help you with actually running these tests, because it requires a lot of statistical expertise. It's not something anyone can do. But also involve people with context knowledge, because you require a lot of context knowledge to actually gauge how these systems might create these kind of ripple effects that we just talked about with the parking example. Because if you don't have those people in the room with the appropriate context knowledge, you will miss this. And you might not know that you need to check for fairness between different groups of people, for instance. So that influences the decisions you make about fairness metrics, which you might deem appropriate or not.
Right.
If I look at this, and if you look at it from a fairness perspective, and a lot of these algorithms are built in closed environments because you want to make sure that nobody knows what's happening. And sometimes it has to do with security reasons, but we also know that there's a lot of issues with a lot of algorithms. And if you look at it from the outside, what do you see? And it's a little bit tracing back to what we were discussing earlier in relation to fairness, but what do you think the role is, for example, of journalists to make sure that that everybody's right is at the table? I mean, we see a lot of cases that it's a long time afterwards, but how important is the role of journalists in these cases to make sure that businesses and public organizations are on top of their game to make sure that fairness is made possible?
I think it's a very important role that they play. So one of the cases I was looking at in my PhD was the Dutch Siri case. No, not the Apple Siri, but another kind of Siri, which was also a risk profiling system. And there I looked at the accountability relations between different parties, different institutions, if you will. And what was interesting there is that the media actually played a huge role in amplifying the voices of, for instance, NGOs who were concerned about this. They published about it was the first time an algorithm was dragged to court in the Netherlands. So they published a lot about this lawsuit. And that helped raise a lot of attention to this matter. It helped gather like a critical mass for public pressure on politicians, for instance, to ask questions about this, make regulations, but also to get it banned. So the judge eventually, it's a bit it's a bit complicated, but in the end, the system was not allowed to be used anymore. The judge ruled, and public pressure really helped. And the media have a large role in amplifying this kind of critical literacy on these systems. And they also play this kind of controlling factor on government in this instance, because the case I looked at was a governmental algorithm. Yeah, so I would say very important.
And an extension to that, sorry, Claudio, because I was I was thinking about while you're answering, and I was also okay. But then you have to make sure that there's a certain level of literacy on algorithms, on fairness, on what is the impact on exclusion by systems. Um, do you think currently there's enough attention for that, or do you think it's really limited to a few sources?
I think it's slowly getting more attention, but I would say at this point, it's usually a couple of sources, like the usual suspects, that actually publish extensively about this. But those sources might also create ripple effects themselves. So once they create like a huge story, it gets picked up by other media, even though they might not have AI experts, for instance, within their institutions themselves.
And you name two of them specifically that people said, "Hey, these ones are the ones you should follow and check out on what they're publishing."
Yeah, so ProPublica we already mentioned, of course. There's also in the Netherlands, it's Follow the Money is a very good source in that regard. Wired is also a very interesting publication platform to follow. So there's a couple of different ones, but yeah, just to name like three.
Right. I would
Thanks.
throw the New York Times in there too, in terms of,
Yeah,
organizations that
definitely.
do
Yeah.
deep data dives into or do deep data analyses of these, which is much needed. And I really do feel, or I really do hope that there will be more data journalists and more basically AI journalists out there that are covering it from a point of view that's really nuanced and where they're really doing their research and really doing their homework. But a lot of that depends on access to data. And, I remember 2008 when Obama was elected in the United States, all of a sudden, open data was the buzzword. And then since 2017, everything in my country has just been gradually been, access has been more and more limited to data. And things are happening in very strange places that don't necessarily see the light of day. So you may not have something published, but it'll come out, for instance, like in an RFP for public bidding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So it pops up in different places.
Exactly. But so let's say you've got the company North Point that built COMPAS. To what extent are they liable for any of the inaccuracies that their decision engine has? Is it totally on the court system, or are they totally free of absolved of any sort of liability?
I am not well versed in liability, because that depends very much on the contracts that they made and the legal system in the US, which I'm not familiar with. But
It's your opinion.
In my opinion, I think they should be held liable for it. But yeah, that's my opinion.
No, but that's interesting because that's one of the reasons why we asked you. And that's also a difference between Claudio and myself. I mean, if I look at myself, living in Europe, we have a different view on responsibilities than the US has. And that is an interesting part. So that's why we really asked for your opinion.
Yeah, I think it's also reflected well in what they call like the European approach to AI, which is also encapsulated within the AI Act, of course. And there, well, I think the system would be forbidden actually, so it probably would not be allowed to use. Or if it would, then it would be high risk, and it needs to have all kinds of fail-safes, including that the provider must demonstrate that it is not biased, that it is fair, whatever kind of definition of fairness you choose to use,
Right.
of course. But then also provide information, provide documentation, register the system in a database so that, the oversight authorities can actually check these systems so they know that they exist and they can find them. So there would be a lot of measures placed on systems like this, and it would not be as happy-go-lucky perhaps as it is now.
It's forcing them to take responsibility for the type of algorithms they use, the responsibility to make sure that it's fair, the responsibility to make sure that you don't discriminate against specific groups. And I think that's an interesting perspective if you look at it. Within Europe, we are really focused on saying, okay, you have a responsibility as a business, as a public organization to protect customers, to protect users. And I think that is one of the biggest differences between the European approach and the US approach.